Welcome back to Into the Omniverse, the show where we take a look at each and every universe comic books have to offer. This is a two-part video covering the basics of Marvel's Multiverse, and it's been a long time coming, so let's get started. First though, click the card in the upper right-hand corner and vote on which Marvel universe we'll cover first. And while you're up there, check out my two-part video on the DC Comics Multiverse. Let's begin with the real world. Our story begins in 1961. Allow me to paint you a picture. The United States was in a war in Vietnam that would drag on for another 14 years and prove to be very unpopular, to put it mildly. Protesters had been taking to the streets since the war's start in 1955, but still in 61, the bulk of the war, and thus the bulk of the protests, had yet to happen. The second wave of feminism was just getting started, and the civil rights movement had been going since the separate but equal doctrine was overturned by the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. The 1960s was a decade of sorely needed progress for minorities and women, but none of it came easily, and we're still dealing with these important issues to this very day. So among all of this chaos, we find Stanley Lieber, a man quickly approaching 40. He had already spent some 2 decades in the comic book business. The industry was in bad shape. It had been in decline for some time, and so Stan had to fire his staff of writers and artists. He was alone in the empty offices of Magazine Management Company, owned by Martin Goodman. The company had hired him as a teenager for $8 a week. As we've discussed before, he wanted to write a novel, but he'd never been able to get around to it. At the time, the comics industry was printing books about scary monsters, cowboys, and stories of romance. Stan couldn't see how he could work his big ideas into those kinds of books. After the Second World War, the popularity of superheroes fell into a sharp decline. The few superhero books that had survived were all at DC Comics. The most enjoyable things Stan was writing at the time were corny jokes for magazines like Blushing Blurbs and Golfers Anonymous. And speaking of golf, it was a golf game between Martin Goodman and Jack Leibowitz from DC Comics that would lead to a huge superhero revival, or so the legend goes. But first, let's jump back in time to 1939 and Motion Picture Funnies Weekly #1. To vastly oversimplify, before Marvel was Marvel, it was Timely Comics. And in October of 1939, Timely published Marvel Comics #1 by contracting with First Funnies Inc. to provide content. This was Funnies Inc.'s first real sell. The only other book they'd put together was Motion Picture Funnies Weekly, a promotional comic book distributed to movie theaters, or rather it was meant to be. Only 8 sample copies were ever printed, 7 of which were discovered in an estate sale in 1974. While Motion Picture Funnies Weekly wasn't exactly successful, it contained the first appearance of Bill Everett's Namor the Submariner, the first story that would take place in what would later come to be known as Earth 616, the main Marvel continuity. That story was expanded upon and repacked into Marvel Comics #1, along with Virgo's original Human Torch and other content. Fast forwarding 22 years later, in 61, the Comics Code was already in effect, and the Silver Age of Comics was about 5 years old, depending on who you ask. In the very same year that Stan Lee fired his staff, national periodicals, better known even then as DC Comics, printed The Flash of Two Worlds, kicking off what would come to be known as the DC Multiverse card in the upper right-hand corner. This would quickly lead to the creation of the Justice League, a new take on 1940s Justice Society. It was a hit. Goodman came back from his golf game with Leibowitz with a brand new plan: bring superheroes back to Marvel Comics and copy DC's fancy new Justice League book. Lee wasn't so sure. He'd seen attempts to revive superheroes come and go. He was about to quit. Lucky for us, his wife Joan gave him some sound advice, and Lee decided that he would work his big ideas into these new books. If the powers that be at Marvel didn't like it, they could just fire him. Spoiler alert, he did not get fired. I cover all of this in greater detail in our videos on Stan Lee, the Justice League, and the Fantastic Four. And speaking of Marvel's first family, Fantastic Four #1, drawn by Jack Kirby, a legend in his own right, even at the time, was released on November 8th of 1961. It was Marvel's first attempt at a superhero team. It was different from what DC was offering at the same time, a sign of things to come. By 1962, the company had abandoned all the different names it published under and rebranded as Marvel Comics. Spider-Man and the Hulk also came along in 62. 1963 gave us Iron Man and the X-Men. Marvel was on a roll. You know who else is on a roll? Amazon.com. This video is brought to you in part by Amazon. Below in the description, you'll find links to all these comic books and lots of sweet Marvel merch. If you see anything you like, buy it, or anything else you need, and this channel will get a cut of that sweet, sweet capitalism. Or just go to amazon.com/shop/fancyteeth and buy from there. So that's the creation of the main Marvel Universe, but when did it become a multiverse? Well, for that answer, we've got to switch gears and look into the actual continuity. The first mention of a multiverse came with Doctor Strange. In November of 1965, we got Strange Tales number 138, wherein Stephen Strange meets Eternity. Now, Eternity is a celestial being, an anthropomorphic manifestation of reality. Let's just quote Marvel.com directly. Eternity came into existence when the universe was formed, along with siblings Death, Oblivion, and Infinity, who is often said to be one with Eternity, and spontaneously assumed the collective consciousness of all living things in the universe. He is every living thing, and every living thing is him. In 1967, we learned more about celestial beings in the Eternals from comic legend Jack Kirby. The very first universe to ever exist was embodied in a being called the First Firmament. In his loneliness, he became the creator of both the Celestials and the Aspirants. The Celestials wanted their own creations to live and evolve. In fact, they created the main Marvel Universe, but the Aspirants were not down with that plan. For now, all you need to know is that these two groups went to war and shattered the First Firmament into the Second Cosmos and the First Multiverse. So the multiverse formed a cycle of renewal, and this process repeated until Eternity became the embodiment of the Eighth Cosmos and the Seventh Multiverse. Now, I have way oversimplified this. The Marvel Multiverse is complex, and the information is often kind of vague, and sometimes even contradictory. Explaining it all would take several hours, and this is just supposed to be a base explanation, and we're not even done yet. We'll get into Marvel's latest creation story, as told in Jonathan Hickman's Avengers, in more detail in Part 2, where we will also discuss the first mention of Earth 616 in the real world, the sliding timescale under which Marvel's continuity functions, the naming scheme used to identify each reality, and more. So jump down to the comments section and let us know. What is your favorite Marvel Comics universe? Until next time, please click subscribe and ring that bell so that you get notified when we release a new video, and please share this video on sites like Reddit, Facebook, and Twitter. If you didn't like this video, then let me know by clicking the thumbs down button, and likewise, if you did like it, then hit thumbs up. And a super special thank you to Bo Smith, Ken Steepe, Lauren Alexandra, Rachel Dallas Fort Worth, Sincerity, the Almighty Father of Lies, and of course, praise be upon the patron saint of Fancy Geeks, Sleepy Hollow. Amen. Please be kind to each other. I'm Jay Parks.